I want to welcome everyone to Global Justice Report, an online production brought to you by the Center for Global Justice. I'm Cliff Durand, your host for today. Center for Global Justice, El Centro para la Justicia Global, is a multinational bilingual research center located in San Miguel de Mexico, de Allende, Mexico. The center is devoted to research and learning for a better world and empowering a solidarity economy. Due to the pandemic, we've had to discontinue our regular in-person events and instituted these online webinars instead. Without our previous revenue-generating programs, we now depend on your donations to support these webinars and to be able to continue to pay our local staff. You can donate at our website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program features Lauren Langman, who will be talking about the American character and the clash of ideologies. And from a small group of devoted Puritan settlers, the USA ultimately became the richest, most powerful empire in the history of the world. Features Lauren Langman, and yet it is now in a process of implosion and decay. Lauren Langman offers a historical, cultural, and characterological analysis of American national character and its underlying psychodynamics. Cultural legacies from the colonial era contribute to today's political polarization. Lauren Langman is professor of sociology at Loyola University in Chicago and is author of God, Guns, Gold, and Glory, American Character and Its Discontent. After his presentation, you'll have an opportunity to raise questions and make comments. But now let me turn the floor over to Lauren.
Okay, I can be heard. Okay. First of all, let me just mention one point. The book is a joint with my co-author, George Lunsko, and I hope everybody can see the title. And what's interesting is you can't see the whole thing because the publisher cut it off. But you can see this is the American Gothic by Grant Wood. But in the back, instead of the church, is a bank, and he's not holding a pitchfork. It happens to be a shotgun. And what you don't see is at the lower end that she's holding a Bible. And this pretty much encapsulates the whole thing. But I have to say a few words of introduction. And I'm going to depart from my usual more academic style with a clear-cut PowerPoint and things like that, and just try to ramble for about 20 minutes and then expose myself to questions, critiques, etc. for a while. Let me just begin with one very simple point. My work comes out of the tradition of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, which is sometimes called cultural Marxism, etc., which emerged in the late 1920s as a response to the authoritarianism, the dogmatism, and the economism of the Second International, or Internationale, if I can pronounce it properly. And I think economism is an important concept here because this is Gramsci's notion of economic reductionism that ignores the cultural. And so the Frankfurt School attempting to update Marx, because the world economy, the capitalist economy, had changed quite a bit by the 1920s. We moved from this kind of early into late mercantile and early industrial capital of machinery to monopoly capital of large corporations and things like that. We saw the Russian Revolution, which is important in a number of ways, which I don't want to talk about here. And so what they tried to do is to develop an interdisciplinary framework to understand the capitalism of its time. And they did this by bringing in some of the relatively newer perspectives, primarily in sociology, namely Max Weber, who talked about the rationale, the instrumental reason, purpose of reason, the demystification of the world, charismatic leadership, et cetera, as well as the psychodynamic perspective of Sigmund Freud, the notion of desire, repression, and all of that kind of stuff that will come out a little bit later in my presentation. And in the background is Karl Korsch, who basically, I don't need to remind the philosophers that Karl Korsch had reminded a lot of people that Marx offers us not simply a political economy, but also there's a strong philosophy in Marx. This is especially true in the 1844 manuscripts, which hadn't been available. They were sitting around in a vault somewhere in Moscow until the 1920s. And just out of curiosity, it was Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse that were the first people to actually read and critique and write about the 1844 manuscripts. And that was a perspective that this sort of continued critical theory to this very, very day. And of course, one of the major was Hegel. And I don't want to embarrass myself in front of philosophers by trying to sound as if I have some Hegel scholarship, but at least the thing that we can remember from Hegel is the notion of the dialectic. And of course, this is that most imponderable document that's ever been printed or that I've ever looked at, the phenomenology. But in the phenomenology, we do see a very, very strong notion of the dialectic of consciousness as it's traced historically. He's not so clear that it's historical, but the movement from nature up to religion and finally absolute knowledge are the reflection of, as Hegel puts it, the philosophy is the expression of a society in thought. And in Hegel, there is that notion of the telos of history, or the telos of spirit is a term he uses, headed toward absolute knowledge. Now, this was very, very influential on Marx in a number of ways, not just in terms of alienation that I won't mention too much about, but in terms of the movement of history through various stages. But for Marx, as most of the people on this audience will know, for Marx, this was also a progression of different forms of political economy. Okay, so now this is where I want to really begin the discussion, which is the perspective of the Frankfurt School. And in the echoes, the background, there's three major publications that I want to talk about. Dialectic of Enlightenment, which is the Weberian critique of what happens when instrumental reason becomes the dominant form of consciousness, especially as it's mediated through the culture industries that give us deception, et cetera, et cetera. Escape from Freedom, that brings in the Fromm's version of authoritarianism, which comes out ultimately from Freud, but is mediated through Wilhelm Reich, etc. And this is the foundations of what later becomes the authoritarian personality. It's probably one of the best known contributions of the Frankfurt School, given the fact that there's been somewhere they've said 20 to 25,000 separate studies of authoritarianism that I won't even start to talk about. Okay, now the basic question that I want to deal with in the beginning of my presentation is the nature of American character. And I depend to a large extent on Alexis de Tocqueville, who to my mind is still one of the greatest observers of American culture. And the framework of the book, being a critical theoretical book, is largely, but not entirely, but largely inspired by Erich Fromm's notion of social character. For Erich Fromm, social character was the most typical, not necessarily the most dominant numerically, but the most frequently found type of personality found in a particular society, and it's shaped historically, et cetera, et cetera. And so I sometimes jokingly begin my presentation, and I'll begin again with the joking presentation of, if you could imagine a conversation, probably on the Champs-Élysées, between Alexis de Tocqueville and Erich Fromm. And this would begin by, je ne sais pas, je n'entends pas les États-Unis. If you don't speak French, it's saying, I don't understand what's going on. What the fuck is going on with America? To which Fromm replies, oy vey esmer. Okay, now in order to understand a culture, like those of us that had children, the conditions of the early of the early experience of the formation of a particular nation state or culture have a legacy that endures long, long beyond the conscious memories of a lot of people. And so this is where the title of our book, and I have to emphasize our book because this was a collective enterprise, God, Guns, Gold, and Glory. What do these stand for? Okay, well, God, bear in mind that the Puritans were a bunch of religious, let's just say strongly religious people, because it's not appropriate to disrespect people by calling imbeciles imbeciles. We'll just call them highly motivated. And, you know, the Dutch couldn't stand them and they threw them in England. The England didn't want them and they put them on a boat and sent them over here. Now, the important thing is that these were extreme fundamentalists. They were very, very strong. They wanted to get rid of the entire Church of England and the Catholic Church. Of course, these were products of the Reformation. The interesting little note here that's not often mentioned in the high school textbooks, since most of the high schools don't use anything except standardized books. They don't, use the protect them. The first person off the Mayflower was a guy holding an Italian gun. It was a blunderbuss, sort of like a little tiny, sort of a little shotgun kind of thing, and that gun itself happens to be sitting in an NRA museum, and it's called the Mayflower gun. And I think that just this little vignette tells us an awful lot about what's happening in America. I had a house guest over the weekend, so I didn't tune into the morning the news this morning, so I don't know where today's shooting was, but I'm pretty sure that there was a shooting somewhere in the United States today, and this has a tremendous bearing on our culture, as we'll see. Okay, now what was interesting is that the Puritans were very, very religious people, as we know, but over time, because of the nature of colonial life and the expansion of West, slowly but surely, the Puritans actually became a little bit less puritanical. They did establish schools. Maybe some of you have heard of these little dinky universities, Harvard and Yale, that were originally theological schools. But as time moved on, as you began to develop a merchant class after the farmers survived, or the people that became farmers, and they survived because the Native Americans helped them, we started having a movement toward a more educated business class. Now, I could spend a lot of time discussing Habermas in the public sphere here. I'll just mention it because you finally begin to find an elite class of merchants, especially in the northern colonies, and their wealth came from shipbuilding and whaling because they had a lot of wood and a lot of sailors, and they were by the sea, and so they developed very, 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 very prosperous. They had a lot of ships going back and forth to the Caribbean, bringing back sugarcane that became rum, that went to England, and it became very prosperous. And as they became prosperous, some of them became a little bit less religious, and they started reading this very, very subversive stuff. And I guess maybe some of the philosophers and other people have heard of people like, Rousseau, Montesquieu, and probably the most important of which would have been John Locke, especially the second treatise on government that establishes a basis for government other than monarchy, or at least not exactly, but close to it. And of course, for Locke, the basis of freedom was the ownership of property. If anybody's ever read the Federalist Papers, some of them, I don't know if they had plagiarism laws when Jefferson was writing, but some of the Federalist Papers are straight out of Locke. So what winds up happening is we start developing a prosperous economy in the North, a merchant economy largely, and a very prosperous, perhaps even more prosperous economy in the South based on slavery. Now, if we go back for a moment to those guns that came over with the Mayflower and became part of the culture, the gun has been a very, very important part of American culture, beginning with the necessity of the genocide of the Native Americans, who's we just celebrated National Genocide of Native American Day a couple of days ago. We're at the end of that particular holiday. And when you have, 50, 60, 70, 80, African slaves working in the field, and one overseer, how come, that overseer maintained his power? Well, he generally had a couple of shotguns and a couple of revolvers, which were very helpful in maintaining the institution of slavery. I think it's also worth mentioning at this point, the political economy of slavery, in that how do you justify slavery at the same time believing in some kind of democracy and things like that, in which all men are created equal? Well, as most of us know, it was very simple. You just, don't recognize, back to the Hegel, recognize the fundamental humanity of a person whose skin content may be a little bit different. And we get all kinds of cultural legacies of animal-like and stupidity, et cetera, et cetera. Now, this would be rather boring stuff in a history book if it didn't play out in our contemporary politics as of today, as I'll get to later. Okay, now, as I said, the colonies were very prosperous, and soon we began to see a movement of what I will now call today, I didn't call it so in the, we didn't call it so in the book, of a movement from salvation anxiety, which is what Weber called, the Protestant ethic, namely, if you worked hard to get to heaven. That's not exactly the way Weber put it, but for now it's okay. But it kind of moved from religious status anxiety to economic status anxiety. And as many people have pointed out, one of the things that was taking place in the new colonies is that without a feudal system of inscription, what was your status based on? Your status was based on the fact that this was a land of opportunity. One of the first discussions of the new country in 1797 was the letters of a French farmer, Henri de Crevecoeur, and talked about America being a new country in a new time, and a time of prosperity where anyone who worked hard, and of course was willing to assassinate a few Native Americans in the process, but anyone who worked hard could become prosperous. But the other side of that prosperity was its fleeting nature, and that no matter how wealthy you became, you could also lose it. And this status anxiety, as we'll see in a little while, becomes an important aspect of American character. Okay. Now, in addition to what we've talked about so far, the religion, the guns, and the greed, America was basically thought of as, God's gift to, that the land was bequeathed by God. And I first learned this long before I even went to college, but in some of the older Westerns, and some of the people close to my age may remember these Westerns where there was this great character actor, a bearded guy named Gabby Hayes. And sometimes he'd be the driver on the stagecoach of the covered wagon, and he'd yell, "Hi ho, and it's on to the New Jerusalem." And being a nice Jewish boy, I had no idea what the hell that meant, going to the New Jerusalem. But later I would understand that New Jerusalem was the land that God bequeathed to the Puritans to lead the world. And as most of us know American history, America has been very, very instrumental in bringing the world, especially countries like Vietnam or Libya or God knows how many, into peace, prosperity, brotherhood, tranquility, and prosperity. It didn't work out that way, but I'll let other people talk about what wound up happening. But we do have that notion of America as being the be-all and the end-all. Okay, and so we have this notion of a God-ordained exceptionalism. And we see elements of this in other settler colonies. This is clear sort of in South Africa, but South Africa never developed the power that the United States did, nor did Canada or Australia. Okay, now, what I want to get to now is how these various conditions that we've talked about have had an impact even on today, and how these legacies, these cultural legacies of our country still play out today. Okay, and so one of the ways they play out is a certain dialectic of social movements. And this is a way of understanding the cultural side of dialectical materialism that Marx talks about. This is not an alternative, it's a complementary or a mediation, if you want to use those Hegelian terms. Namely, to suggest that one of the things that takes place is that there's a sequential, there's a sequence of social movements, and how certain movements generate their opposite or their own negation, if you want to use that negation of negation language. So, for example, slavery, the existence of slavery itself fostered abolition, which was very weak and very limited until we got until the 1861. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about it, but to just say that the conditions of slavery were in violation with the norms, with the Enlightenment norms of freedom, and ultimately, because of the material changes and things like that, we wound up getting the Civil War. One of the consequences of having a democracy based on the vote but that democracy was limited largely to rich white men. And these were the kinds of things that generated abolition, as I mentioned, but also suffrage. And most of the people here, especially women, will know that in 1844 we see the beginning of feminism in the United States, a progressive reaction to the oppressive change that's taking place at this time. Okay, so I want to kind of shoot forward to kind of wrap it up, or I won't exactly wrap it up, but kind of bring it to what's relevant today. What I'm trying to suggest is that these legacies of the early nature of American character, these legacies of early formation, played out in American history in a number of ways. So, for example, part and parcel of the Protestant individualism has been the individualism that's with us today. But there's a big history that's not usually covered. You have to dig deep to find it. A long history of communities and co-ops and things like that. Some of the companies that are named brands today, like Oneida and Oneida, Amana, these were originally communally owned. There's one state bank in this country, I think it's North or South Dakota, which is the only bank in the country that didn't lose its ass in the 2008, things like that. Okay, so I want to kind of move up to the conditions of 1930s and the Depression, and just sort of briefly mention of FDR, and in reaction to the long-standing free enterprise capitalism, which collapsed in 1929, we see the beginnings of a welfare state. And it's also important to remember that part and parcel of the welfare provision, in order to get the Southerners on board, much like getting the Southerners on board to form a nation, they had to exclude domestic workers and agricultural workers. And I need not remind this audience exactly who the domestic workers and who the agricultural workers were likely to be that were excluded from any kind of social benefits. Now, the important point that begins to really take place and change our society is World War II in a number of ways, not just the beginning of the military-industrial complex. That's for somebody else's discussion. But something that we need to remember was Rosie the Riveter and the millions of other women that were suddenly taken or moved from their homes to the defense factories, where they took over jobs that had heretofore been male jobs, operating big, heavy equipment. I mean, these machines, anybody that's ever been in a classical factory, some of these machines are several stories high and they clunk down and they're complicated. And how could frail, delicate women ever manage to figure these things out? Well, frail, delicate women basically showed that they were neither so frail nor delicate, and they figured it out. My favorite anecdote on this part was the fact that the largest factory in the world at this time was the Willow Run factory, run by Henry Ford, one of those great loving Americans, and inclusive. Yeah, okay, so he was a racist and a Nazi, but you can't win them all. But they were producing a bomber a day. Now, this was an extraordinary task in the 1940s, to produce one bomber a day. That usually take several months to build a bomber, but this was being built by women. Maybe the women were faster bomber builders than men, but they then had a problem of getting the bombers over into the front line. And so guess what? Women were trained to pilot multi-engine planes. And anybody that's ever gone on an airplane, when the cabin door was open, you could look in. How could women figure out how to fly a plane with all those engines? And if you look ahead, there's all those meters and all those buttons and levers to pull and push. God, somehow women managed to do it. Nowadays, we see that there are women that can operate F-35 fighter pilots, but at the time it was kind of unthought of. I actually took flying lessons at one time, and I learned how to fly, but my arms got tired, so I gave that up. But anyhow, getting back to the topic, women felt a sense of agency, felt a sense of empowerment and this began the demise of patriarchy that's not going to come to fruition for a while. This also had an impact on the sexual revolution in a number of ways, two ways, which aren't usually discussed in most things of the sexual revolution. It really didn't begin in 1962 with the pill that the common sense tells us. There were about something like 10 or 12 women around for every single man or married man that was straying, back in the 1940s. Well, I don't have to explain the numbers and things like that. We already know that by 1947, half of all American women had basically, however you want to put it, crossed the bridge or gone under the bridge or something like that. At the same time, most of the American servicemen abroad had been in cultures that were a little bit more relaxed, we'll put it this way, or as one of the things we know, that one of the horrors of war, and this has been true since the ancients, is that the conquering army, the males take advantage of the women. Anyhow, the point is that we begin to see not just a change in women's agency and empowerment by working, but we begin to see the beginnings of a changing sexual revolution. There was a little blurb of this in the 1920s because of the affluence, but that was limited largely to the affluent college population for reasons that I'll talk about later if anybody's interested. One of the things that's beginning to happen now is, as a result of African Americans fighting in World War II, a lot of them had the notion of why are they fighting for a democracy that they themselves don't have. Frantz Fanon, who was fighting for France, basically said, fuck it, this is a white man's war and it's not doing any good for us colonialized people. Well, a lot of African Americans began to feel that way, especially when they were guarding German prisoners who were treated better than they were. There were a lot of prison camps in the South where they used African Americans to guard them, but the African American soldiers weren't treated as well. There's a little side story here about the Tuskegee pilots, the all-black fighter interceptors, that basically had one of the best track records of defending American bombers going over Germany in the war. But we begin to see growing pressures towards civil rights taking place at this point, where we begin to see one of the first points of this growing pressure was 1947, when Truman desegregated the military. When I started teaching, I had a friend who was an African-American psychologist who had been in the war, and he said that, that most of the African-Americans that were there were in quartermaster and supply and intelligence and nowhere near the front lines. One, a lot of the military didn't want African Americans to have guns, and the African Americans had no desire to go up to the front line and face German panzers and Junker Stuka attacks and things like that. But after the war, we begin to see more and more pressure, a GI Bill that basically excluded a lot of blacks, but we begin to see a growing power of blacks. To make this story, this particular thing important, this begins to change in the middle of the 60s with the Civil Rights and the Voting Rights Acts. So in other words, we begin to see a couple of things taking place in the 1940s that don't have fruition to the 1950s in terms of social movements, primarily that racism confronted democracy, and ultimately there's more pressure toward democratization. Women at work decide that they want an agency and empowerment. After the war, they're put back in the homes. And probably the best statement of this, actually the very best statement of this, was Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex. But in this country, the best statement of this was really Betty Friedan's the Feminine Mystique. Now, all these things got coming together. And there's prosperity after World War II. We all know about that history of prosperity. I think the French use a term, what was it, les glorieuses 30, the wonderful 30 years, 1945 to 75, where everything is coming up roses. And part and parcel of that affluence that's now taking place is changes in child rearing toward a more permissive, more relaxed. This is Dr. Spock, the influence of Freud on child rearing. And we begin to see the beginnings of a real major change taking place in the 1960s. And some of my fellow old fogies that are on this chat will remember, the days of drugs and sex and rock and roll, as well as some fancy Marxist theory and things like that, and anti-war movements. And many of us had been activists in some of these movements. And it really looked like there was some real social change taking place. But as I said before, there is this telos of history in which the progressive movements will foster reactionary movements. And this is what happened. Following the civil rights movement, the southern states immediately abandoned the Democratic Party, joined the Republican Party, and we know what happened in 1968. Tricky Dick became president, and this set in a long period of pretty much conservatism, even when you get centrist Democrats like Obama and Clinton, etc. The other thing that's happening with affluence is that a small number of people begin to see the truth. Eric Fromm had pointed this out, this notion of having that affluence, having all kinds of consumer goods that some sociologists like myself refer to as a plethora of tchotchkes, namely house filled with the latest junk. And I'm glad that people are here and they're not out shopping for Cyber Monday, which follows Black Friday. But a lot of people are beginning to see the hollowness, how shallow consumerism is. And this was seen, for example, in two major intellectual currents that didn't get widespread, but some of us may remember, the Beat Generation for Ligeti, Ginsberg, Burroughs, etc., or the counterculture, or the existentialists. And so a small number of people begin to kind of reject materialism and status as an anxiety-ridden status as a form of life, and began to, you see the elements of the counterculture. And by the time of the 60s, we can use the pill as a marker, but it didn't change much in terms of action. It changed it more in behavior. But we generally see those wonderful periods of drugs and sex and rock and roll, which of course set in the counter reaction. And that's getting to where we are now. Okay, now what I want to try to argue, and to try to finish my argument off, is these progressive movements have had a tremendous influence on contemporary politics, beginning with civil rights. And the reaction here is the various white power movements that are trying to stop, if not reverse, history. A good example has been the whole agenda of the Trump administration and MAGA, which is an almost entirely, not completely, but almost entirely white organization. Not only is it a highly white organization, but it's also a defense of patriarchy. As more and more women have entered the labor force, a lot of men, quite rightly, feel castrated. When I say rightly, I don't mean that they're correct. I mean that the system has not been very kind to men in terms of job loss and the lack of training and things like that. The shift of much of our work from rural agriculture to various high tech, and this has really had a tremendous degree of questioning of masculinity. I'll come back to this in a moment. Religion seems to have sort of peaked in the late 20th century, because ever since the year 2000, religious attendance has decreased and religious participation, especially among the evangelicals. The evangelical population has declined by about 30-some% in the last 20 years or so. Okay, now we put these things together, and what we see is that these legacies of American culture that were with us from the moment that the first man stepped off the Mayflower are now under tremendous assault. And this gives us this clash of ideologies that's at play in our current politics. The defense of patriarchy in terms of male power. If we just think of some of these militia groups that where the men dress up like soldiers. The men are my age, they can barely pick up their rifle, but they have pot bellies, but they're ready to defend the country. The racism, we see how many of the mass shootings have been racially motivated or against gays and things like that, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I want to try to wrap it up by going back to critical theory that brought emotion into the Marxist analysis, that these various assaults on traditional forms of identity, whether it's economic status, religious status, male status, have led to at least 4 reactions. The first one, ressentiment. For a group of philosophers, I need not explain what Nietzsche meant, but for those who aren't studied in Nietzsche, very simply, it's a feeling of resentment toward the elites. It comes from Nietzsche's critique of ressentiment of the Jewish priestly class that had become the slaves of Rome, and the resentment that they felt toward the Roman leaders. Why? They had wealth, they had power, and they had unlimited sexuality of every form known and invented a few. And what did the Jewish slaves have? For the Jews, that would be called bubkis. If you don't understand Yiddish, it means they had nothing, but they were morally superior. And so the The Jews were highly, they were humbled, obedient, compliant, the herd mentality, as Nietzsche called it, and they developed this resentment, ressentiment. Nietzsche used the French term to capture. It wasn't just being resentful, but it was a sadomasochistic anger and punishment toward the elites. You mean like the guys who run neoliberal capitalism? Perhaps. Okay, besides resentment, we also have the second thing of what we call the fear of death. This comes out of the work of Freud, mediated through an anthropologist named Ernst Becker, who talked about the fear of death being one of the greatest motivators in the world, far more motivating than sex, especially as you get older and become closer to death. And this leads to the embrace of nationalist or religious movements that give a sense of self and security. This is sometimes in the literature, the popular literature, referred to as replacement anxiety. Those of us who saw, none of us were there, but saw what happened in Charlottesville. The Jews will not replace us. Replacement fear, whether it's by Muslims, Jews, or African American, plays a major role. We might also have necrophilia, something that Eric Fromm talked about, not so much having sex with a dead body as the technical term, but the love of death and destruction among those whose self-esteem is challenged. And finally, there's an element of shame. This goes back to the importance of economic anxiety that shaped our society from the get-go, or at least the early get-go. And when people fail economically, they will blame themselves, even if it has to do with political economic factors. Okay, my final point is that I don't want to spell out gloom, doom, and despair as many of the Frankfurt Schoolers did, but I want to see that part and parcel of what I've been talking about, which I didn't underline till now, is generational change. Now here I want to mention two things. One, the brilliant work of Karl Mannheim, who argued that every generation was shaped by the economic, cultural, by its historical milieu. And once that generational identity or cohort identity, he didn't use the term identity, but their general, the values go on as people carry with them the values of this particular time in the lifespan, about 18 to 25. And so what we see happening now are the people that grew up in this century have already changed. This is the Generation Z. And for Mannheim, or using Mannheim, there were four elements that were important. And here I'm citing the work of John Volpe, a survey researcher. He's not a sociologist, and he doesn't have a word of theory in his analysis, but he basically sees the Z generation, that's roughly 18 to late 20s, as being shaped by four very important moments. One, 2008. Wait a second, 2008, these were little children then. But nevertheless, many of their families lost jobs, had to move from a house to possibly a trailer or a smaller apartment. And even though they were young, they felt the pressures of a capitalist conflict. Okay. Secondly, they were very much influenced by Occupy Wall Street that took place there 9, 10, 11. And even though Occupy was not a movement as such, it was more of a moment than a movement, but it made us very much aware of the inequality in our society, where we now have three guys, Bezos, Gates, and Buffett, have as much wealth as about half of the American population. Think of that. Three men have that much wealth. It's obscene in any way, shape, or form. And we also mentioned the shootings at Parkside. And so one of the things that we've seen now is this growing population of very, very progressive kids. Those of us that teach know that they may be fuck off as students, but their values are very, very progressive. Over half of them refuse to identify their gender in a binary thing. They're somewhere in between. Over half of them, 52%, favor socialism over capitalism. That's the good news. Only about 1 or 2% of them really understand what socialism is. It's not the welfare state. It's not college tuition. It's not, it has to do with worker ownership of the means of production, but that's for other people's topics. They have left religion, as I can tell you, having been at Loyola for a long time. in the average class of 30, maybe one or two might go to mass, that they've left it. And so what we see is this ideological clash that's taking place, and this ideological clash is taking place in our political arena, that as the classical forms of identity are being challenged and undermined, we've seen this growing reaction, which probably began, at least in the early part of this century, but especially, actually, we can see some of these militia movements going up and emerging in the late 1990s, et cetera. But we see this clash taking place, but the future is optimistic if we get our climate under control. If we don't, we'll go the way of the dinosaurs. But the Z generation is politically motivated. And if you look at the recent election, many of these elections were very narrow, but it was the young kids that came out in the second highest rate that the young kids came out and voted that gave us our Democratic Congress, or at least Senate, and saved it. Now, quite obviously, I'm not a Democrat, but given the reality that we have today, and we don't have a socialist party in this country, that this is really, just a sign of the things that are to come. And so I want to conclude, covering several hundred years of American history, if not thousands of years of philosophical history, to say that things are optimistic. They look good, maybe not in the short run. And I'm just hoping at this point, the latter part of my life, that I do live long enough to see OAC president, and she'll become what the psychoanalysts call the transitional object between, between the Democrats and the Socialist Party. And with that, I think I've covered a lot of room, and so I'll open up for the comments, questions, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lauren. We will want to open the floor to questions and comments, but those who are watching this on YouTube will have to email their questions and comments to me at global.justice.cliff@gmail.com, and I will then pass on here in the Zoom room. Questions directly, just raise your hand, and I'll be happy to call on you. Okay, Mark Ginsburg.
Lawrence, thank you very much. I'm trying to catch my breath. You've covered so much, and I look forward to reading the book. I have two issues I'd like you to discuss that I don't think got addressed, but I assume your framework might provide some insights into them. One is organized labor, and why they have and have not at various times been a force for progressive or less than progressive change. And the other is, does the American character contribute to the destruction of the environment, and in what and or toward trying to save the environment and combat climate change? Maybe one of those or both, if you can address it.
Let me try to address it very quickly. Yes, I mean, for what it's worth, under no circumstances whatsoever try to buy this book from Brill. I think they want $1,000 for it or something like that. Okay, if you go to Haymarket, they occasionally have a sale, and if you can get it on sale, it's like $15 or $18 when it's on sale, and you can wait. Okay, so that's whatever. Okay, in terms of labor, I couldn't cover very much. I mean, just a few hundred years of American history, and of course the different social classes of America, from slaves to oligarchs, et cetera, et cetera. But part and parcel of the labor movement in this country has been shaped by this earlier trend toward individualism. And this has been a part which I couldn't talk about too much. I talked about it. I spent more time talking than I had planned on it. But if you look, for example, at, this becomes really clear in the 1800s, the anti-immigration movements, and part and parcel, especially of the various Catholics coming in, they were as much resentful as, as Mexicans are now today. Why? Because they were collectivists. And maybe some of the people that know the history, these were papists. That meant that they were going to turn the country over to the Pope, which was a collective orientation. Now, of course, most of us know that once the Italians, especially the Italians, became prosperous, they became Republicans. That's a different story. So labor unions have not just had to fight against the capitalist motherfuckers, and as we know labor history, people like Rockefeller, etc., had no qualms of hiring guns, the Pinkertons, for example, hiring guns to control the labor union. But they were also up against a culture that wasn't very friendly toward the collectives, even though there were various collective enterprises that did take place. This is that dialectic. So in other words, yes, organized labor had an important role. And what is really interesting today has been this tremendous resurgence of labor that's been going on lately. And the interesting point here that I didn't address is that much of the movement toward labor is the fact that a number of our college students that they thought that a lifetime of debt would get them great jobs are working as baristas at Starbucks or delivery people. And some of them sat in our classes, and although they were basically sending text messages to each other or watching porn, some of them absorbed a little bit about the appropriation of surplus value by the capitalists. And even though they paid just enough attention to pass their final exams, it doesn't come home to them until they see where, if you're an Amazon driver, you have to have a bottle with you so you can pee because you don't have time for a pit stop and things like that. So we're seeing a resurgence. It was about a month ago, Bernie was in town and he was addressing a labor organizer. And one of the women, I forgot her name, it might have been Nelson, she was the head of the Delta flight attendants. I couldn't believe it when she said, "It's now time for a general strike." How many times have we ever heard American labor mention Rosa Luxemburg? So that there is this change that's taking place, and I hope I answered your question as best I could briefly.
Yeah, definitely about the labor, the environment. Go on to other people and maybe
On the environment, yeah, I mean, the environment is not unique to the United States. I mean, let's face it, the world's biggest polluter right now is the capitalist, anyway, what is it? The People's Republic of Capitalism. They're still burning a lot of coal. But I do think that increasingly, this is not a specific topic. I think it's an important topic, and it may very well be. I mean, it's sort of like if we have World War III, if Putin starts World War III, 1 billion people may die, but we got 6 or 7 billion left. But if we don't control global warming, there's no jobs on a dead planet, and we are headed for very serious things. But that's not uniquely American, and and a lot of Americans are practicing greenwashing, attempting to offer some kind of minimal policies, but we are back. American capital is the most powerful political force anywhere, much more powerful than corporate power, corporate capitalist politics elsewhere. And so given the power of the oil industry, especially over the Republican Party, it was amazing that Biden got as much accomplished as he's done. He doesn't get much credit. And, as a socialist, I don't like to applaud him very much, especially since I couldn't vote for him. But we do have to get that. But that's not uniquely American, except insofar as America was really the place that invented consumerism. That's for my next discussion.
Thank you very much.
I see Talmadge Wright has his hand up.
Hey, Cliff. Hey, Lauren. See,
Hey,
I did show up to hear you.
I'm glad.
We've talked about this before as colleagues, and it's pretty obvious that if we look back at Amr Lefebvre's idea of the 60s movements as the social explosion, right, that's still going on in essence, that there is, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, the environmental movement, these are all movements that originate from the explosion in the 60s, in which the kind of corporate control of the system that was critiqued by people like, the great man, the gray flannel suit, and other things from the 50s. that's been pretty much put by the wayside, as we agree, and that consumerism has kind of substantially replaced this idea of the kind of stoic man that was popular with that kind of idea of classical individualism that Robert Bellah talks about, right? It's been changed into possessive individualism, that you are what you buy and what you consume. The question I have, and this is why I've been putting on Facebook, and I think you know this, is how do we move from this I hate the word identity politics, but how do we move from this explosion of fragments of the return of the repressed that Herbert Marcuse talks about in the 60s to a more integrated collectivist position that actually sees the human species as an area that has to be organized around? And there's various ways we can talk about this. Ralph Nader just gave a really good interview with Chris Hedges on the Real News Network, in which he decried the problem of both Democrats and progressives as not tackling the issue of local power, city councils, education boards, Congress, where we have a real possibility of substantial change, even though it may not be socialist. The point is that the Republican Party has actively organized, like Lenin would have recommended 40 years ago, to take over all levels of government from the local to the top, and Trump was, of course, a result of that. So I guess the question I really have and this is for everybody, including Lauren, which is, how do we create a political party, a structure, something, whatever, that is able to unify these diverse movements in a way that doesn't sacrifice their particularities, but yet still embraces a universal idea of human rights and freedom and democratic expression? I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Okay. Next question.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, there's, you raise a really, very important question. Okay. Number one, one can understand if one disagrees with identity politics. And, I've often come across a situation, because I would say something like 1/4 of the things that I've published have identity in the title. And people say, oh, yes, I read your stuff. You do identity politics, at which time I have a minor temper tantrum, not a major temper tantrum, but minor. I do not do identity politics. I do politics of identity, which is exactly the very opposite, because the problem with identity politics, as most of us know, is what the social movements people like myself call, silo activism. In other words, very few gays are terribly involved in environmentalism, or maybe Black Lives Matter doesn't really concern itself with disability, things like that. So how do we do it? I kind of gave you a hint at the answer of this, which also speaks to the demise of consumerism. 30% of the young people don't own cars. They don't want cars. They don't want to drive anymore. Now in California, where you live, you can't even go shopping without a car. But the whole point here is that for a lot of people, part of it is making a virtue of necessity, given the nature of the economy. On the one hand, I just saw this morning that the the Black Friday sales hit an all-time peak. But in general, that's not the younger kids, the ones that, have 2 jobs, neither of which are very good jobs, but they've. So I do think that this mad kind of consumerism has kind of reached its peak. And I do have a tremendous amount of hope in the younger generation who are moving away from consumerism, moving toward, as I mentioned, Eric Fromm. Eric Fromm is a wonderful book. I forget the exact title, but something on being and having. And one of the points that he makes is that human fulfillment is not based on the accumulation of goods, but the realization of one's own particular unique talents, of having strong networks of friendship and caring and sharing and things like that. And I do think, I could be wrong, I better not be wrong, or the human race doesn't have much of a future, that we are in that transitional period right now. Now, I noticed that last week I had to watch it couldn't watch it live. But Nancy Fraser was there, and Nancy Fraser, following Gramsci, was talking about, she wasn't talking about specifically in her discussion there of cannibal capitalism, but one of the points that Gramsci made, which I want to come back to in a second, Tal, one of the points that Gramsci made is that right now we're in an interregnum, a transitional period where the old is dying and new is not yet born. And the sign of that interregnum is morbid symptoms. I have a paper paper I never published. I have a lot of papers I've never published because I have ADD and I write a paper and forget about it. But a paper called, Donald Trump, Morbid Symptom of the Interregnum. And this much of the stuff that we see, January 6th is the best example, but we see this in the daily shootings every day. I live in, as Tal would know, I live in an upscale neighborhood. It wasn't upscale when I moved here. It was basically third world when I moved here, that a lot of the people were African Americans. Having got my political start in civil rights, that never bothered me. A lot of the people were Spanish speaking and living in Mexico and speaking enough Spanish to get by. That never bothered me either. And then the yuppies moved in and the neighborhood changed. This may become a dangerous neighborhood, that there's carjackings going on, murders and stabbings, and in the area I live in, and that's not unique. This is happening all over the country, in New York and Los Angeles, that there's this greater level of violence. I think that the FBI figures are that the violence is up something like 30-some% in the last 2 years. But I do think that we are in a transitional period. The last point, and I think this is a brilliant point that you mentioned, we don't like to talk about Republican intellectuals because we think they're all stupid. If you think they're stupid, how the hell did they manage to control the world so much? A lot of them read, I mentioned Gramsci. A lot of them started reading Gramsci when Gramsci was first translated. And they understood that you want to run a war of position, you don't start at the top, you start at the local levels. And this is why we have school boards that are burning these radical left-wing subversive books by communists like Mark Twain, and they're burning Marx, they're burning these kinds of books. Or these local libraries that are burning books in which they talk about, can you believe that there's teenagers that have sex in this country? Oh my God, what is the country coming to? And they are burning books on sex education and things like that. I wasn't around the last time they had book burnings. That was before I was born. But I think if I remember some of the documentaries of Germany in the 1930s, you see these great big bonfires. This is what happens when these groups get control, because let's face it, running for the school board is hardly something that most people are dying to do. But they understood this. And this is why one of the real problems we have of the next election is a lot of election deniers have been elected. Not necessarily only one case. Well, I don't know if Vance is really a denier or not. But at the top, they haven't done all that well. But a number of these other, let's face it, the most glamorous political job in this country is not Secretary of State, okay? But let's not forget, the Secretary of State is the one that's usually in charge of the voting. And this is basically, there's three things that count on voting: how people vote, the turnout, how people vote, and how the votes get counted. And he or she or they who get to count the votes can determine the outcome of an election. And as many of us know, the last election was largely determined by the fact that Hugo Chavez was able to run the Dominion voting machines through the Nest thermostats where the voting machines were held. I think we have time for one or two more questions before we break.
Well, Harry Targ is waiting to ask a question.
Should mention
Hi,
that
Laura.
Harry and I went to the same high school.
Right. I'm so proud of your presentation and knowing that you and I learned this at Senn High School in the 1950s, right, in north side of Chicago.
That's where I first read the volume. That's where I read Capital, my social studies class.
I have a question and perhaps a problem. I found your presentation fascinating, but again, there's the howevers. One, I find that people can and do identify different periodicities and develop narratives around their particular periodicities. And for me, there are two periods of great significance, and I used to teach U.S. foreign policy. One is the 1890s, particularly the Spanish-Cuban-American War and the globalization of American empire. And two, the 1940s, after World War II, and along with Rosie the Riveter and African Americans coming home and demanding equality, There was a qualitative shift in the direction of military spending. There was the rationalization of it based upon the communist threat. There was the significant threat of the 1946 strike wave and its resolution leading to the Taft-Hartley Act. And later on in the decade of the 40s, not only the Marshall Plan, but NSC 68, the US government commitment to perpetual military spending. The long and short of the story is that it seems to me one could build narratives that include economics, politics, and culture that highlight and privilege different perspectives. And while I like yours, I like mine as well. The one thing that maybe is a little different between yours and mine is I see an inextricable connection between the domestic and the foreign. And right now, I'm intrigued by the work of Vijay Prashad, who argues that perhaps the fundamental fissure in global society today is more between North and South than between sectors of powerful countries. And I think Prashad is trying to get us to think in a new way about the nature of human reality that transcends national boundaries and emphasizes these profound fissures between the North and the South. So I don't know if you want to comment on this.
Not only would I want to comment, but I could probably do it for another 3 hours, beginning with the fact that in the work that I personally do, and I could only cover, just a little tiny bit of it, like all of us academics can. One of the places where I have not a difference, but a difference of emphasis with the more traditional political economy, and I mentioned probably more than anyone else, the influence today is Eric Fromm. For them, capitalism was in the background. It sucked, but it was in the background. I do a lot of stuff on political economy that is integrated. When you buy the book and read it, you'll see that there's a lot of political economy in there, including strikes and things like that. That part and so I don't have any disagreement with really what you're saying, especially in terms of the military spending that is also, kind of supported by this legacy of violence that really began with the colonies. There's a wonderful, I didn't want to get off my topic too much and talk about a lot of American literature, but there's a wonderful 3-volume book by a guy, I think his name is Slotkin, on the conquest of the West. It's a literary criticism. Oh, you know the book. And one of the terms he uses is moral redemption, which means that God blesses those who kill Native Americans or those who don't love America, such as in the Spanish-American War. I don't think a lot of the Filipinos feel, they didn't show enough love for America as to protest our conquest of the Philippines that you would know better than I was a very, very long, bloody war that most Americans don't even know took place. Et cetera, or the blowing up of the Maine, the boilers blew up, and of course they blamed the Cubans and used that as the pretext of the war. This goes back. So I have no quarrel with, with the intersection between the political, economic, and the foreign policy, et cetera. And in terms of globalization, I don't want to sound too narcissistic, but I'm one of the founders, along with Jerry Harris, who comes on this program occasionally, of the Global Studies Association. It's now the largest collection of global scholars in the world. There's over 1,000 people on our lists. We have some loose affiliation with the Center for Global Justice, as many of you probably know. And so one of the main principles of many, not myself, it's not the work that I do, but the work of a number of people that are tied to our center, namely Bill Robinson, Jerry Harris, Leslie Sclair, on the whole notion of a transnational capitalist class consisting of the elites of local capital, local political elites, all tied to a global economy. And this global economy today is completely dominated by the, imperial powers, largely of the North, as you want to, if you want to put it in those terms. Of course, Australia is part of it, and Australia is part of the South, but that's besides the point. We don't want to get into real geography where most Americans couldn't find, would know the difference between Australia and Antarctica if it wasn't on the map itself. So in other words, I think that, that this whole notion of imperialism, globalization is extremely important. And in fact, in some ways, and this is discussed in my book, some of these factors have been accelerated by the nature of globalization, because globalization is not simply the fact that when you buy a car, its parts come from all over and it was assembled in a particular day, but part and parcel of it, which I didn't even begin to talk about here, has been the change in the nature of political economy, especially financialization, which is where most of our dollars are today. And when I tried to explain this to students, and I found one of the most difficult things for me to ever explain to undergraduates, because they have no economics whatsoever, is the notion of a derivatives market. It gets too complicated to explain to undergraduates. But the derivatives market is about $600 and some trillion, which is something like 10 to 12 times the GNP of the world. This is why my neighborhood changed. And this is what Saskia Sassen has made her early career on. That cities changed because these new industries, had to have a concentration of expertise, of lawyers, of accountants, of engineers in more or less the same place. And these people are sort of modern wage labor slavery, but they make a lot of money, but these MBAs straight out of school are starting out with $50,000 bonus signings, maybe not so much anymore. And, and they start out at $150,000, which most of us academics never reach that level, but these little pishers, another Yiddish term, these little pishers are starting out with that. But they're working 18 hours a day. They don't want to drive 2 hours out to the remote suburbs. And so almost every big city, we see this massive, gentrification taking place because they want to live nearby, want to live where you have, overpriced restaurants with hanging plants and brick walls and things like that, and celebrity chefs. And I live in a neighborhood like that. It wasn't my choice. It was poor when I got here, et cetera, et cetera. But so there's much of the changes that you're talking about and the periodicity, I very much do incorporate into the argument. And so I don't think that we have any particular real difference. It's just in terms of a limited amount of time, how much can you cover? And I think I did try to bring in the importance of World War II. I didn't mention how it gave rise to the military-industrial complex, but remember, I did mention the Willow Run factory that at the time was the largest factory in the world, largely assembling B-24 bombers. And this was an amazing feat. And then after the war, many of these plants then turned to consumer goods instead of, producing tanks or producing cars. So I think we might, Cliff, how much more time do we have? I can stay for the next week.
You're not allowed to use a bank account anymore.
I didn't hear that.
Okay. We have another question from one of our YouTube viewers. Doug Morris is, let's see, let me show you his question.
Where would it be, on the chat? Oh, okay.
Okay. Doug writes, how might these legacies God, gold, guns, and glory be playing out or declining today through the cultural power of corporate capitalist social media? That is, how is the United Statesian social character being shaped and directed by corporate capitalist social media, which is also a global force? Is it possible that the Z generation is being victimized by a massive behavioral modification experiment through social media and algorithms? Where is that experiment headed?
It would take me another it would take me another expression to fully answer that, but I think that's a really fantastic question. Why? As a social movement scholar who tries to integrate critical theory with social movements, I was one of the first people following what happened in Chiapas with the Zapatistas and then the anti-WTO movements. These were enabled in large part with the Zapatistas, more the financial, but with WTO, enabled by the internet. And this was, some of us are old enough to remember when the internet was not something that was easy to use. It was very difficult to use, and we couldn't get pictures or anything like that. Just as an interesting aside, much of the ability to use films and make payments on the internet came from the porn industry. That's just an interesting aside. I'm not sure it has much to do with anything, except what I earlier said. One of the legacies of the years and years of repression is the explosion, not just of the online porn as a business, but most of the porn that's online are amateurs who want their 15 minutes of fame. But that's a different thing. Why is this a good question? I alluded to it earlier when I talked about the emergence of the bourgeois public sphere that took place in the early colonial period, when a lot of the descendants of the Puritans and some of the immigrants as well became affluent and started reading things like, the Enlightenment philosophers, especially the progressive Enlightenment philosophers. And so, as Habermas pointed out, that with the growth of this bourgeois public sphere, you had a political force, public opinion, but Habermas pointed out that it went into demise with mass media, the culture industries, etc. Okay, but one of the things that we have seen with the internet has been the tremendous growth of thousands of different channels and site places. And one of the things about the internet is, if you want to find out the real truth about how Trump was appointed by God to get rid of all the child molesters that are in this country, that are kidnapping, torturing children for their adenosine or adenosine or something like that, you just go into any of the dozens and dozens of Q programs. But going back to Harry's mention of Vijay Prasad, I read most of his stuff on the internet, which means, and I just recently did a paper for the psychoanalysis in the public sphere conference, that the internet basically provides the information that people want that's going to be consistent with their character. In other words, for people like us, there's going to be a number of things that we're likely to look at, from socialist worker to daily costs, which is more of a, or port side or stuff like that, that's left-wing liberal, not necessarily socialist, but most of their factual data is fine, as opposed to go to some of the other sites and we find out that, Hunter Biden was really a major embezzler and dope dealer and user, et cetera, et cetera. So the internet has both emancipatory and reactionary potential. Most of January 6th, whether Trump admits it or not, most of that was well organized on the internet, which has been causing a lot of question. So the answer is that American character is at a point of change right now, as we're moving from a reactionary, progressive, more authoritarian society toward a more progressive society. And part and parcel of that is the role of the progressive side of the internet that is not likely to be controlled. Whether or not there's an experiment to brainwash the Z people, probably not, because they're much more selective in terms of the material that they're likely to incorporate. And, once you have this particular character frame, I don't know if anybody here besides me who has to read this stuff because of the work I do, if you've ever read this stuff on right-wing sites, you would not believe it's beyond bullshit. It's just complete fantasy. Just go to any of these right-wing sites. I get about 5 or 6 of them. They all have Patriot in the thing, and they'll talk about how, Joe Biden is wonderful for the right wing. He's either enfeebled, mentally incompetent, and can barely walk, or he's the most tyrannical despot in the 21st century with the power to control the world. Which is it? I don't know. I don't pay much attention to that stuff, but it is very interesting how the authoritarianism that's part and parcel of the right-wing character, and this was, Eric Fromm, Wilhelm Reich pointed this out before most of us were born. I think probably before all of us were born. But that's authoritarianism or a democratic personality shapes the kind of information you're going to get off the internet. And then, and progressive people, unless they're doing research on it, aren't going to waste their time with the trivia. On the other hand, the right wing is not going to look at the left wing propaganda. And I don't think you get that many mega people watching this program, Cliff. Sorry about that.
Well, Lauren, there's another point I'd like to ask you to reflect on. The how the American public responds to moments of crisis. In the 1930s, we saw that the response was very progressive and pushed Franklin Roosevelt to adopt progressive policies that were unheard of in U.S. history. Whereas today we see a crisis where a major part of the population, at least, is moving in a very right direction. How is that possible?
Well, there's no simple answer, but from what I was saying is really this, and to a certain extent, the answer is in your question. From what I was saying, to a large extent, the support for the welfare policies, which were relatively, stingy compared to, the welfare state really begins in 1871 when Bismarck, that noted left-wing communist disciple of, Lenin hadn't been born yet. Well, he was we know that, Bismarck was a disciple of Marx. That when people were basically, standing in lines in soup kitchens when unemployment was 25 or 30%, the economic took precedence. Okay. Now, I don't want to slight the role of the political economy today. As I said, more than other critical theorists, I focus on political economy. But to an extent, one of the consequences of political economy is indirect in that it forces a great deal of cultural anxiety. And so even if your job isn't in peril, the uncertainty of the economy forces a lot of people to the cultural right. And so what we're seeing today in terms of a lot of these economic movements, a lot of these cultural movements, the patriot, the anti-feminist, the anti-gay, the racist movements, these are not directly motivated by economic factors. So it's not that they're afraid that African Americans are going to take their jobs, they're going to take their status, their meaning, their values. And so, for example, nowadays, it's just completely normal and natural, at least for most of us, that most of the people here are likely, like myself, to have African American friends, and there's no big, who cares? But for a lot of people, so in other words, what we see happening is that the cultural factors turn people much more likely to turn people to the right. Now, this is not invariant, because in my larger writings, when I begin with Marx, Marx did write a lot on on two very important political movements. In the 18th Brumaire, he talked about the right-wing coup of Louis Napoleon. And ironically enough, this one was very much motivated by the economic hardships that the French peasants were experiencing. I don't think we have time to go back to the 18th Brumaire, but basically half of the population of France was rural, who had gotten the land from Napoleon Sr., and now, after several generations, they had much smaller plots and much bigger mortgages. And so here we had an economic factor leading to the support for Louis Bonaparte. Okay. Then 20 years later, because right-wing leaders are fuck-offs, he starts a war against Prussia. And I guess maybe Harry could talk about this better than I can. But if you're going to start a war, don't start a war with a country that is better armed, better trained, and has better logistics than yourself, because the French got their asses creamed. And when the French government withdrew from Paris to Versailles, the working people, established the Paris Commune. Unfortunately, it only lasted for about 2 or 3 months because the Prussians and the French decided that they hated the idea of a more socialist, anarcho-syndicalist community than they hated each other, and so they jointly, what did Marx say? The streets ran red with blood, or something to that effect. So, in other words, whether a movement goes to the left or the right is not automatic, but in general, fear and anxiety lead people to the right. And this is exactly what Rome said in Escape from Freedom. Does it always happen? No, and that's the thing that makes our lives as academics interesting. We have very, very few ironclad laws that X always leads to Y or something like that, that these are always dependent on large numbers of social factors. I do think, and I could be wrong, and I better not be wrong, because if I'm wrong, the planet's going to fry. But I really do think that we are merging toward a much more progressive economy. And I think that's the good news. The bad news is most of us are going to be too old to live to see it. And if we are alive, we'll be too senile to recognize it. So let me thank everybody for their attendance and wonderful questions, and wish we could go on forever and ever, but we can't. And I know that my approach is a little bit different than many of the approaches coming out of the Frankfurt School, although very loosely Nancy has her origins, but her origins are the later Habermas. And that's, for me, once Habermas moves away from the public sphere and moves into communication, it just becomes a sanitized version of, left-wing thought, as opposed to what's really rooted in, for me, Karl Marx. And just for what it's worth, when I woke up this morning, put my shirt on, this is my Trotsky shirt. I am not a trot in any way, shape, or form. So the shirt, this is that truth in advertising. This is not any support for Trotsky, although I've been to his house a couple of times. That is the one in Mexico where he was assassinated. So with that, I guess thank you. And Cliff.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Lauren, for an interesting presentation. And let me remind you that this, as well as previous webinars, are available on our website, globaljusticecenter.org, where you can also make a donation. While we were talking, we received a donation, and hope that others of you will also take advantage of this opportunity. Next week, we will be having a presentation on the energy reform here in Mexico and the U.S. pushback. I hope you'll join us next Monday at 1 o'clock Central Time. And for now, then let me thank our webinar team, Roberto Robles, Liz Mestras, Gregory Diamond, Olivia Canellas, Bob Stone, Bessie Bowman, and myself. And now this is Cliff Durand signing off.